Weapons is the follow-up feature from Barbarian's director Zach Cregger, and this movie definitely indicates that he is here to stay.
I just want to say how very sorry I am for...
She should be locked up until she tells us what happened!
Weapons is a super interesting film. Cregger has drawn inspiration from great movies like Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia and Denis Villeneuve's Prisoners. The Magnolia influence is a little bit more subtextual, while the Prisoners influence is largely rooted in the locations. So both films were shot in and around Atlanta, but are actually both set in Pennsylvania suburbs. After Cregger came out with Barbarians, which was a film that I really enjoyed, there was a bit of a bidding war for his next project. Netflix got involved. Jordan Peele was public about how much he wanted his production company, Monkey Paw Productions, to get a hold of it, but ultimately it went to Warner Brothers. And Cregger got a pretty good deal here, particularly for a director who is still considered to be emerging. He got a good sum of money, and he also received final cut privilege, which is not super common with larger studios who would like to maintain some sort of creative control. The cast for this film has also changed quite a bit since it was originally announced. The most major shift was the original casting of Pedro Pascal being replaced with Josh Brolin. Pascal obviously just recently was in Fantastic Four, and that took precedent for him when it came to filming. The basic premise of Weapons is that we have this elementary school classroom where all but one student disappear, all leaving their homes at 2:17 a.m., running in the same way towards something, and then ultimately vanishing. The next day at school, we just have Julia Garner, the teacher, and one lone student, while the town tries to figure out what's going on. The film itself is actually rooted in Cregger's own experiences, starting to write this film after losing a close friend and kind of dealing with the feelings that come with that. The anger, the grief, the guilt, even at times. And he has described his kind of approach to writing as being inspired by David Lynch and this idea of transcendental meditation, almost allowing the subconscious mind to make its way onto the paper when writing. And in fact, Cregger has been quite open about not knowing what Weapons was about. He just started to write. And while it might not seem like it, this film really is a representation, at least on some level, of Cregger's inner psyche. For those of you who aren't familiar with Cregger, he comes from a comedy background. He was part of the comedy troupe The Whitest Kids You Know, and his story is not all too dissimilar from some other emerging directors in this quote-unquote horror genre. We can look toward Raka Raka, for example, the director duo behind two recent films in Bring Her Back and Talk to Me. And then, of course, we have folks like Jordan Peele, also coming from the comedy background in recent years and kind of blowing up on this scene. Again, illustrating this almost intrinsic relationship between horror and comedy. As I mentioned, Cregger didn't really know what direction the film was going to go, but as he recently lost a friend, it ended up being kind of directly or indirectly the story of grief and loss, and he did something that he employed in Barbarians at least a little bit, playing with this sort of point of view storytelling, kind of splitting the film up into distinct chapters, allowing different characters to share their experiences. And this isn't exactly like a Rashomon effect type of storytelling. It's not just characters retelling the same events through their unique points of view. It's more of a contextualization of each of these individuals' lives, kind of what led them to this point and how they deal or cope with their own individual pain and experiences. In Weapons specifically, we have the points of view of the teacher, of police officer, of principal, of a parent, of a individual struggling with drug addiction and homelessness, and the student who didn't disappear. Each of these characters, without going into any sort of obvious spoilers, are each part of Cregger's inner psyche, and this is not just me projecting something onto the film from some sort of pretentious film critic lens. This is something that Cregger has openly discussed. Some of the characters struggle with alcohol and substances, and that is something that Cregger has also struggled with. A character is very angry at this loss, and that's something that Cregger experienced after losing a close friend. And I have so much respect for his confidence in writing and direction and just allowing kind of the pen to move where it needed to move in order for him to tell this story. And it's a great example of the very individual experience leading to a universal story. So often folks try to create something that will have universal appeal, but the best way to get there is to write something deeply personal. The film itself is also super beautiful, which is at least a little bit ironic in a sense because it's designed to be a bit drab, leaning into the browns of this suburban misery, pulling a lot of visual references from Denis Villeneuve's Prisoners, as I mentioned before, but it is very clear that D.P. Larkin Seipel is very talented and is able to bring a clear vision to life. While Seipel might not be a household name right now, he is undoubtedly one of the cinematographers to watch out for, and I don't really hesitate to say that he might be one of the strongest DPs of his generation. He has worked with the Daniels on a couple of films, Swiss Army Man, and of course, Everything Everywhere All at Once. He was also the cinematographer that brought Childish Gambino's This Is America music video to life, so he clearly has a vision, and he clearly has range as well. In Weapons, he had such control over contrast ratios and the use of shadows, both to reinforce motifs, but also as a visual cue for attention and the balance between these shadows and highlights with some beautiful bloom, these highlights kind of rolling off into the shadows, creating this dreamy effect. He really does pull everything together from a visual perspective. Already in this review, I've kind of described Weapons as a horror film, probably because that's just the easiest way to classify it, but it isn't a traditional horror, and Cregger is okay with folks like us describing it as such, but to him a horror film is something that really relies on being scary. But in Weapons, even when it's not scary, it has enough of these narrative threads that keep us wanting more. It isn't so reliant on each individual scare. In fact, I don't think that Weapons is particularly scary. There are definitely moments where it is. The person beside me in the theater let out a pretty amazing yelp at one point in particular, but it has a much slower, deeper human sense of dread than really being truly scary, at least in the traditional horror sense. It is funny at times, which makes sense given Cregger's background in comedy, but it's not super hilarious. There are some laugh-out-loud moments, definitely, but Cregger pulled back a lot of the jokes that were originally written, kind of insisting that each laugh be rooted in this authentic weirdness of the moment, how characters would genuinely react to the supernatural, to things that are happening that really shouldn't be happening. So it's not particularly scary, and it's not the funniest film of the year, and in fact it's pretty slow at times, particularly in the second act, but still it is a very strong film, and it's strong because of Cregger's confidence in his writing and his direction and his willingness to allow these more grounded human narratives to unfold and not force traditional horror or comedy beats onto every single scene. And as a result of this, I have a feeling that some more casual moviegoers who are going into the theater just really wanting to be terrified might leave a little bit disappointed. The ending and really the structure itself is left intentionally a little bit ambiguous. There's room for us as viewers to almost project our own psyche, our own psychology onto the film, and that is kind of the point. There are many kind of interpretations of the project, and I don't think in a situation like this that there are necessarily right and wrong ways to view the film. I can't dive too deeply into my own thoughts without revealing certain spoilers, but I think it's an interesting way to showcase individual response to pain and to grief and to suffering, and also kind of showing the potential generational impacts of trauma, how we as adults really do have a significant influence on the children around us, and how the pain that we may inflict on those children will end up being carried with them as they grow up into adults, kind of exploring the impact of things like abandonment, for example, and how the impacts of that can manifest later in life. At the end of the day, if you are a fan of quote-unquote elevated horror that isn't just reliant on the scares, and you're okay with some slower pacing at times and interested in really diving into some human psychology, then Weapons is definitely for you. Thanks so much for watching. I'm sorry that the videos have been few and far between as of late. I will do my best to continue to put them out whenever I can, and I appreciate each and every one of you for watching. Subscribe, like, comment, do all those things. It really does help me feel better as a human being. So thank you. And I guess, have a really good day, because I hope that you have a great day, because that is a nice thing to hope for. So yeah, see ya.